Thank you. Thanks. See, unlike the response last night, I've got some water readily available right here, so that's pretty good. First off, Charlie, thank you. It's good to be here with Charlie Sykes here in person. I'm so used to being on the phone calling in, but appreciate his presence on the airwaves and his presence here with us today. And I particularly want to say a thank you to all of you for being here, but particularly to Kurt Bauer and the staff and the board of the Wisconsin Manufacturers and Commerce, our statewide Chamber of Commerce, not just for this session, but for the last 2 years, we've talked about creating jobs in the state and creating opportunity. We understand that it's not the government, it's the people of the state that create jobs, and our statewide chamber, as well as chambers all across the state, have stepped forward and really helped us out in that regard. So thank you to all of you for making that possible as well. Today, I'm gonna talk about something maybe a little bit different than you think about. In the last 2 years, I've come here and given a little bit of a rah-rah, and you've heard a little bit about that earlier today. You've heard it from some other panelists, and I could spend all my time talking about it, but you'd say, well, these are some of the same things we've heard about. You know, how our rankings have gone up of places to do business in, how job numbers have gone up, how people's opinions, both within the state and around the country, have improved dramatically over the last 2 years. But I'm not going to go into all the details of that. Today, what I want to talk about is something that I think is fundamentally important for us to continue to go forward. You see, 2 years ago when I stood here, 2 years ago when I had been sworn in as your governor, Wisconsin faced a $3.6 billion deficit. Today, because of the reforms we put into place, 2 years later, we're going into this next budget with nearly a $500 million surplus for this fiscal year, and the next 2 years projected to be steady revenue growth. So we're in a good position to invest in our priorities, the things that we've talked about. But we can't be not concerned about where the future is headed. We've got to be vigilant in being good stewards of the taxpayers' dollars so that in turn, we can put your money back into the economy, not through the government, but through the people of the state, put more people to work. So today what I want to talk about, and you can see on either side, I've got a PowerPoint coming on up there. The theme of what I want to talk about today, and you may have heard a little bit in advance about me being prepared to announce this, is real simple. How do we go from dependence to independence? And I want to spend a few minutes talking about entitlement reform in the state of Wisconsin. So the first thing on that list is dependence. Now, think about that for a minute. Let it sink in a little bit after last night, and think about the folks in Washington, not just the president and others, but there's a whole group of people out there in Washington and some here in Wisconsin who define success by how many people are dependent on the government. You hear talk about wanting more people on Medicaid, wanting more people on food stamps, wanting more people on unemployment checks. And so there's a whole group of people in our state and around our country who somehow define success in government as being how many people are dependent on the government. I'll give you a good example of this. Not too long after I took over as your 45th governor, one of my cabinet members who was charged with heading up what many would call our Department of Labor, the Department of Workforce Development, said to me, Governor, what do you define as success for this state agency? He said, because the staff that was here before told me the way they measured success was ultimately by how many people were signed up for unemployment benefits. They thought that was something that was positive for the state to bring more federal money into the state of Wisconsin to provide unemployment benefits. So what's your measure of success? Well, I thought about it for a little bit, and I said, it's simple. It's exactly the opposite. My view of success is not by how many people are dependent on the government, but more importantly, by how many people are no longer dependent on the government. Not because we've kicked them out into the streets, no, but because instead we've empowered them to control their own destiny through a job in the private sector that means more freedom and more prosperity for them and all the rest of us in the state. That's what we should be aiming for. So today, when you see that word, which will flash back up again, dependence, you see the next slide up there, right after dependence. The next slide up there shows about, if you look back and see, since 1994, it'll test my eyes today to see the numbers up there. But if you look at that chart, what's interesting is from 1994 all the way through where we're at, look at the increase in terms of not only the total amount that we spend on Medicaid, but see that blue line? That's the percentage of our state's population that are dependent on Medicaid. Bottom left-hand corner is 10%. Upper right-hand corner is 21%. We're approaching a quarter of all the people in this state who are dependent on Medicaid for their health insurance. Look at just that category from about halfway through up. You see just in the last decade or so, a 73% increase in people who are dependent on Medicaid. Those are phenomenal numbers out there. The next one up there shows, the next slide shows about, not only in terms of how many people are on, but go all the way back to 1987. You see in 1987 in the bottom there, we had about $1 billion was spent on Medicaid. Flash forward at the end of the chart, going into this next budget, and we're exceeding $8 billion. $8 billion. In fact, you see the green about 2/3 of the way over. That was a little bit of an influx where the Federal Stimulus Act poured money in here, and instead of using it on infrastructure and roads and bridges and things that everybody thought it was for, it was used to backfill in some of the Medicaid deficit. But so that artificially backed out some state dollars. But then we had to build on that hole, which we'll talk about in a second, and go from there. But we're looking at something that was once $1 billion is now on track to be over $8 billion in terms of what we spend on Medicaid. Next up shows on that slide, the next slide up shows about not only how much we spend overall, but look at that. That's the amount, state money, state funding that we spend on Medicaid. Look at how much that has gone up over that same time period, from '87 to the end of our budget cycle. And look at the past decade. Almost 100% increase. Almost 100% increase. Now, all of you in business start looking at your cost out there and you think, it's pretty hard to sustain, isn't it? No matter where the money's coming. Federal, state, match of both out there. So, looking at a couple of the other slides here. We'll go on to the next one. It's not to say that we haven't made a commitment. In fact, 2 years ago in this budget, even though we had a tough budget to deal with, as you all know, 2 years ago, we still invested more than $1.2 billion of new money, new state aid, into Medicaid in this state. Why? Because we knew that unless you made some changes, if less changes were made to Medicaid and who was on that more people not being covered, more needy families and children and seniors who would lack coverage as they'd done in the past where they pulled back in reimbursement or made some other changes, would push that off, those costs onto other employers, because individuals end up showing up at the emergency room in their hospitals, and then that uncompensated care gets passed on to everybody else who pays through private insurance. So it's a real challenge out there. So we put 1.2, almost $1.25 billion in new GPR in. But here's the other interesting part of this equation. For this budget, the budget I'll come out with next week on February 20th, I'm putting an additional $644 million on top of the 1.2 or 1.2.4 that I put in the last time. I'm putting that in, and not only am I putting that in, but read that second paragraph. You see why I'm putting in a good chunk of that? Almost 40%, 39% of that cost, of that additional $644 million that I have to have just for cost to continue of Medicaid, comes because the federal government has pulled back from the commitments that were made in terms of what we anticipated for reimbursement from the federal government. That's important to remember, because for those out there who are saying, hey, you know, there's this federal money out there for expansion and other things like that, well, the federal government isn't even paying in this budget for what it cost to continue for what we anticipated would have been there in the past. It's a pretty compelling case to be made. It's because of the reasons that are laid out there. So the next slide up shows right now in Wisconsin. Now, there are different categories of people that we provide Medicaid assistance for. There's much more generous benefits for our seniors and for certain individuals with developmental and physical disabilities and other categories. But the big area we talk about the most in terms of the drivers, who should be in and who should be out, are adults, non-elderly adults, so people 19 to 64. Right now, you can see the vast majority, about 3/4 of all the people in this state in that category, are covered when it comes to private insurance. Next to that is Medicaid. Oh, sorry, go back. Next up on that to Medicaid, you can see the much reduced number. And then right now, obviously the exchanges are up until January 2014. There's nobody in the exchanges. And then in that last column is the number of people, just under 500,000 people in this state who are currently uninsured. That's what we have today. Now keep that in mind as we look at the next slide. Our goal, as I've talked about this, people have asked me, what are you going to do? Are you going to accept it or not? And we've said, well, like any of you would do when you look at a problem in your businesses or your organizations, you don't accept just black or white on things. You say, Okay, let's look at the problem and then try and figure out a realistic way to tackle it. But usually, one of the things you want to do is take a step back and say, what's my true objective here? A lot of times in politics, we get pigeonholed, particularly by the federal government, into it's either got to be this way or that way. My goal in looking at this is two things. One, I want to have fewer people in the state who are uninsured, but along with that, I'd like to have fewer people in this state who are dependent on the government. Remember that number, 224,580. 224,580. The reason that's important, I'll show you in this next slide, is because out of the options I had, remember I showed you earlier the different ways that that non-elderly adults get coverage today. I mentioned there are different types of dealing with that. And right now, about 477,000 people are uninsured in the state, or about 14% of the population. Now, I had a chance to look at different options. The proposal I'm talking about today will reduce the number of uninsured people in this state by 224,580. Let me repeat that again. My proposal today will reduce the number of uninsured people in this state by 224,580. Now, below that, you see the other options. If I'd gone ahead with the Affordable Care Act, the mandate in terms of if the federal government had had its way and the courts hadn't given deference to the states in terms of the decision last summer, all of us would have been forced to go down that path. We wouldn't have had a choice, but we were given a choice. So I had to look at that choice, a choice that some of you have heard some of my opponents commenting about. Well, under that option, it's slightly different, but that's the one option in terms of how many individuals would be reduced on the uninsured rolls. And the bottom option is the one that probably would have saved me the most money, just over $150 million, but would have allowed me to go completely the opposite direction and dump a whole bunch of people off and not take a significant bite at reducing the number of uninsured in our state. So what I chose is the top option, 224,580. Next slide shows a little bit about why that's important, not only in terms of reducing the number of uninsured, but if you look at the three different sections there, the colors align to what my proposal is in the blue, and I'm not good at colors, the purple, I guess it would be. In the middle is what the federal Obamacare mandate would be. And then the green is the third option, which is if we had just gone with the bare minimum that we were allowed to do under the Supreme Court's ability of the states to make up their own decisions. In each of these three sections, you see the bottom left hand is the change in the number of uninsured. We reduce it dramatically, 224,580. But most importantly, when you look at the totality of that, is the middle is the number of people on Medicaid, the number of increase or decrease. And the final section is the number of people who are on private insurance or on the exchanges. Why that's important is because remember I had those two goals, reduce the number of people uninsured, but also reduce the number of people who are permanently or long-standing dependents on the government. Why? Because in its essence, I want the funding that we provide to things like Medicaid to be for what it was meant for people who are poor. Not to be a permanent way of life, but to be a temporary hand up, not a permanent handout. And so what our goal is, not only are we dramatically reducing the number of people who today are uninsured through our proposal, but we're reducing the number of people who are on Medicaid and increasing the number of people who are getting covered under the private insurance market or under the exchanges. To me, that just seems like a logical way to go, because in the end, not only is it better for me and you as a taxpayer, because there's less of a federal and state match that we have to plug into Medicaid, it empowers people to have greater control over their lives. Because where do they have the most control? They have it in that column to the right. The more people we get into private insurance and into the exchanges, the more latitude they have over what happens in their lives and the lives of their families. The more that they're moved in the middle or in the left, the less power and control they have over their own lives. So what we're really talking about here is entitlement reform. You see in the middle, dramatic increase in the number of people on Medicaid. Now, on the surface, that sounds pretty compelling. When you've heard the press conferences, you've seen some of the ads, you say 175,000 more people. It wouldn't exactly be that number, but you see these larger numbers on Medicaid. That sounds, on surface, might sound somewhat reasonable until you realize, wait a minute, isn't the bigger objective to reduce the number of people who are uninsured in this state? And that's exactly what we do. But we do it not by plowing more people into a government-funded program. Instead, we move people into the private sector and into the exchanges, where they not only provide savings to the taxpayers, they ultimately provide more control, more independence, more authority to the people and the families who participate in that. That's what this is all about. So the next slide up shows, again, that number. I'm pretty good at repetition. 224,580. Not just for all of you, but for the media and others as well. That's the number of people that will go down from the current number today. There will be 224,580 fewer people under our plan who will be uninsured once we put this into effect. So people can say or do what they want, but the facts are the facts, and those are the way the facts line up. That's tremendously important to us. But it's also important in doing it in a way that makes good long-term financial sense, and in a way in which we control our destiny here in Wisconsin. We don't leave it up to the federal government. Now, a couple other things along with that. Somebody might say, okay, well, is it really affordable for people above poverty to be able to afford the exchanges? Remember, above the federal, the definition of poverty in this country, which is the federal poverty line, at that point up through 138%, the exchanges under the Affordable Care Act provide a subsidy to make the health care exchange affordable to individuals and families who are part of that. So look at that. If you're someone who just creeps over 100% of the federal poverty line, which means you move out of that category of poverty, if you're just above that, you're paying, what, about $19 a month as an individual for health care. Now, I realize when you're just above poverty, every dollar's difficult, but $19 isn't an unreasonable amount. We're not talking about hundreds of dollars. We're talking about less than 20 bucks to get health care under the exchange. You can see as the ranges go, as it goes from a family of 4, in other cases as the numbers go up there. But that's going to be one of the critiques out there as well. You're just moving people into the private sector and exchanges. They won't be able to afford it. But the data shows that they can. Any reasonable conclusion shows that it is extremely affordable under that option to go beyond Medicaid and to go in a position where individuals and families will be able to control their own destiny. So the next slide up there shows one other thing to be mindful of. Remember that slide I showed you earlier where 39%, almost 40% of our current cost to continue, the current cost to continue, not to expand Medicaid, but just to do what we're doing right now, 39% of that is because the federal government has backed away from what we thought they were going to do to begin with when it comes to Medicaid. Add to that number. Add to that number not only the debt clout, but go one more slide up and see where we've gone just over the last several years in terms of our nation's debt. Over $16 trillion, over $16.5 trillion. Does anybody believe that a federal government, a Congress, and a federal government that right now can't fulfill the commitments it's made to states like ours and others for what it costs to continue is going to be any position to make those commitments good in the future for expansions of that? I mean, I think it's one of those things where I try to look out as your governor, not just at the federal level, but in general, having come in and inherited that $3.6 billion deficit, I want to make decisions that set us up for better financial success in the future, not head us towards greater problems. And yet, you look at that chart, I think it's hard to argue that it's almost inconceivable as to where they're going to get the money to continue, let alone add dramatically to the amount of money that they have there. I certainly hope as an American they do find a way to get to that, but I don't think it's one where it's reasonable for us to just assume that all the money's going to be there. In fact, even if you do assume it, remember, under the provisions of the current Affordable Care Act, Obamacare, that only lasts 100% of reimbursement, only lasts 3 years to begin with. It eventually goes down to 90%, even if you believe, which is hard to believe at those numbers, even if you believe they're going to come up with the money, it only ultimately ends up at 90%, even before they've made any changes. And imagine in all the budget negotiations, discussions they're going to have in the coming year, you got to think that some of this is going to be on the table because it hasn't even been enacted yet. It hasn't even been fully used yet. So look at